After delivering a man possessed by unclean spirits while in unclean territory and surrounded by unclean animals, Jesus now encounters two daughters, each in dire circumstances, facing their own form of impurity. Again, Mark uses the sandwiching technique to interweave the two stories, one of Jairus' daughter and the one with the woman with the bleeding condition. Both stories involve females referred to as daughters, both involve the span of 12 years, and both demonstrate Jesus' authority over conditions that rendered people ritually impure. And so let's just go ahead and take a look at what we have for us, which is Mark 5:21 and following through the rest of the chapter. Here I have a chiasm. We're not going to go through the chiasm, but I do want to note just as one point, and that is the sinner. And note here how it pivots on faith. Jesus is going to commend this woman and tell her that her faith has saved her. And then right as this is happening, news comes that the daughter of Jairus has died. And so Jesus is going to turn and address Jairus, imploring him, do not be afraid, just have faith. And so ultimately, that is the heart of these two stories. Now, as we move down, I covered this material already, and I'll just read you this portion here from Gulick's commentary. He says, the issue of impurity, so prominent in 5:1 through 20, which is the Gerasene demoniac, relates to both the woman's condition, which made her and any she should touch impure, and also Jesus' physical contact with the corpse of the dead child. I do like this concluding remark from Gulick. He says, therefore, set alongside of 435 through 520, which would be the calming of the storm in the sea, up to the Gerasene demoniac. And then through these stories, the focus of these miracles has moved from Jesus' power over the forces of nature to his power over the demonic forces to his power over sickness and death itself. But we will go ahead and just pick up with the text itself, Mark 5:21. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, remember they've been run out of Gentile territory, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet. Now I'm going to speed run some of this. Boring is pointing out here that he would have been a man of some means, partially evidenced by the fact that his daughter, we learn later in the narrative, has her own room, which would not be typical. That's more typical of a wealthy person. But more to our interest here is Jairus' name itself. And it has one of two origins. It either transliterates he enlightens or possibly he awakens. That's actually the name of Elhanan's father in 1 Chronicles 20. But as I point out here, if connected to the concept of awakening, compare verse 39, where the child is not dead, but sleeping. So Jesus is going to awake the child, right? So if it's connected to this concept of awakening, this poetic sense of awakening occurs in a classic Divine Warrior text, Isaiah 51, 9 through 10. Again, if you've seen my Jesus slept video, this is typical of the God of gods, this image of the top deity being the one who is actually capable of sleeping. So this is why at times the psalmist or the prophet will call on God to awake. It's because they're able to actually rest to the point of sleep. I know that's a weird metaphor because we typically more associate God with the other metaphor that he never sleeps nor slumbers, is always vigilant. But to say that God sleeps is also kind of evocative of this older idea of God being the top deity, the one that can sleep. So when Jesus is sleeping, it's the only time in the Gospels where he sleeps, and it's during the storm. There's a lot of theophany kind of stuff going on with that. And so that's what I talk about in that particular article. But here is one of these passages, very clear Divine Warrior, where he's implored, awake, awake, put on strength. Now, of course, again, if this is the origin of Jairus' name, right, this would basically be Jairus. But continuing with the text, O arm of the Lord, awake, as in the days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? Of course, Rahab is one of these Leviathan-like chaos entities. And then verse 10, was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to pass over? In other words, this is Exodus language, which takes us all the way back to the introduction of Mark's gospel, where he wove all of this Exodus, new Exodus kind of language together. But all of this may be evoked in something as simple as Jairus' name itself. But moving down to verse 23, and he implored him earnestly, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live. And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. That she may be made well is more literally saved. And so Collins writes here that here and elsewhere in Mark, the verb to save is used in the sense of saving a person from physical ailment or from death. Elsewhere, however, the same verb is used with regard to eternal life. Mark 8:35, 10:26, 13:13. Jairus seeks his daughter's rescue from death. The members of the audience of Mark, however, who know the gospel as a whole, may infer a second level of meaning relating to eternal life in the kingdom of God. In the same language of be made well or to save is going to occur again in the narrative, as we'll see further down below, picking up at verse 25. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. Mark, in his typical style, shifts the focus from the 12-year-old girl at death's door to a woman suffering an affliction for 12 years. Emboring writes of this, a story that had begun with a plea for Jesus to come and touch the utterly passive daughter who can take no initiative on her own is interrupted by, and turns out to enclose, a story of a woman who takes all the initiative as touch her rather than touch he. That's rather interesting because there's a number of similarities between these two women, these two daughters, so to speak. But even in the ways that they are different, they're still connected. And so the 12-year-old girl can take no initiative of her own because of her condition. Meanwhile, the woman suffering this condition of 12 years takes the initiative herself to go and touch Jesus. Now, concerning the discharge of blood language, Collins writes here, I'm just going to skip down to the conclusion. Thus, this, again, however this is usually translated, flow of blood, discharge of blood, whatever, should not be translated as hemorrhage, but as flow of blood. It's more of a nuts and bolts issue, but here Gillick is getting more into the theological aspects here. He says, though unspecified, her problem has been associated by implication with a ritually defiling bleeding. And he points to the Greek of Leviticus there. Consequently, the purity question so integral to the previous story, the Gerasene demoniac, comes immediately to the surface. This woman was not only defiled, she defiled anything and anyone she touched. Her illness had left her personally, socially, and spiritually cut off. And moving down, Edwards picks up similarly, anyone who came into contact with her during menstruation would be banished until evening. Josephus basically says that they still observe this in that day, which would have been roughly Jesus' day as well. So accordingly, a menstruating woman and whoever touched her was banished from the community until purification. Emboring likewise picks up that this was continued into the rabbinic age. But picking up lower in his quotation, he says, Mark does not mention husband or children, since vaginal bleeding prohibited marriage and was grounds for divorce. In the understanding of her culture, which she shared, the woman cannot fulfill her function as a woman to bring new life into being as a mother. Like the leper of 140, her life is actually a living death, and her healing would be restoration to life. Like the child who waits in Jairus' house, she is beyond all human hope. Moving down to verse 27 and 28, she had heard reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. This is the second of three instances in Mark where the crowds seek healing through touch. Mark 3:10, our passage here, and Mark 6:56. Notably, there is a progression in what is being touched. First, Jesus himself, then his garment, and finally the fringe of his garment. Even the second reference to touching his garment is often understood by commentators as referring to the tassels prescribed in the Old Testament. As Mann notes, Matthew's version refers to the tassels attached to the corners of the cloak. Compare Numbers 15:38 and Deuteronomy 22:12. Mark 6:56 appears to echo this same imagery. In both Numbers 15:38 and Deuteronomy 22:12, These tassels are commanded to be placed on the corners of garments, but the Hebrew word translated corners literally means wings. So if we insert that into Numbers 15, for instance, we get, "Speak to the people of Israel, tell them to make tassels on the wings of their garments." Down to Deuteronomy 22:12, "You shall make yourselves tassels on the four wings of the garment with which you cover yourself." This linguistic detail becomes especially intriguing in light of Malachi 4:2. "But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings." As I write here, could this connection explain why the crowds sought to touch even the tassels or the wings of his cloak? Read Christologically, this verse may have inspired the popular belief that healing could be found in the wings or fringes of Jesus' garments. Down to verse 29. "And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease." Gillick notes the terminological connection to the purification rite. The well of blood, or as the ESV puts it, the flow of blood, corresponds verbatim to the LXX of Leviticus 12:7 that declares the woman clean through the rite of purification. Might this wordplay with Leviticus 12 subtly address the underlying purity question of how Jesus could be touched by a defiled person without personal consequence? His power to remove the defilement makes the issue moot. The same would apply to his touching the leper in 141. So that's rather interesting. She touches Jesus, and the mere touch, rather than defiling Jesus, actually puts her in that state of being declared ritually pure. Concerning the language of disease, it evokes both physical and mental torment, as Edwards writes. In verse 29, Mark describes her condition as a mastix, a graphic expression meaning whip, lash, scourge, or torment. The term combines physical suffering and shame, hence something akin to punishment. In a dramatic volley of Greek participles, verse 26 graphs the woman's condition precipitously: having a flow of blood, having suffered from many doctors, having exhausted all her wealth, having not improved, but having gotten worse. The same verse is equally emphatic and categorical. She suffered much from many physicians, exhausted all her resources, and gained nothing. Clearly, the woman's prospects are no better than the dying girl's. Or we should say were no better, because as she touches Jesus, she is purified. Down to verses 30 and following. "And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, 'Who touched my garments?' And his disciples said to him, 'You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me?' And he looked around to see who had done it." Mann notes the Greek of verse 30 as strange. What it means, that power had gone out from him, is equally mysterious. France writes, "The sequence might suggest an almost mechanical sense of physical transfer of power from one body to the other, though Mark is careful to counter this impression both by stressing that it was not mere physical contact that mattered, since many others were pressing against Jesus at the time, and that the basis of this healing, as in other synoptic miracles, is in fact faith. So as I write, what made her touch different? More precisely, why would touching the fringe of Jesus' garment, as described in the other Gospels, demonstrate her faith? Could this be further confirmation that her intention to touch Jesus' garment was rooted in her belief that he was the fulfillment of Malachi 4? And so while I agree with what France is getting at here, on one hand, it's not the mere touch, as if the act of merely touching an object would grant the healing. It's more so what that object was, or more correctly, what that object was connected to, the person it was connected to. And so I think by the touch, she's demonstrating and declaring her faith, which is why we can say that her faith is what made her well, but it was her faith in Christ being the fulfillment of Old Testament expectation. And down to verse 33, "But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth." Many suggestions have been offered regarding the source of the woman's fear. Most likely, it reflects a sense of reverent awe, linking this episode with the disciples' reaction to the calming of the storm, 441, and the crowd's response to the exorcism of Legion in 515. In all three cases, Fear is the root, but the woman's reaction includes trembling, suggesting an intensified awe, likely recognizing Jesus' holiness and power. Her fear is more personal and sacred, while the others react to external displays of power. Garland observes that no impurity is transferred to Jesus. And we've already covered most of this, but I do want to read at least the beginning portion here. He writes, "She has touched the one whom Mark identifies as infused with God's Spirit, and whom an unclean spirit identifies as the Holy One of God. Jesus is the embodiment of God's holiness." Down to verse 34. "And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well,'" or literally saved you. "Go in peace and be healed of your disease." In Luke 13:16, the woman with the disabling spirit is referred to as a daughter of Abraham, but the woman with the issue of blood is the only one Jesus directly addresses as daughter. Garland comments on the healing by faith. Jesus' public announcement, "Daughter, your faith has healed you," could mislead if not interpreted correctly. It is not the power of the woman's faith, but Jesus' holy power that heals her. He does not pray to God for the woman's healing. Mark notes that the power went out from him, revealing that he is the source, not the conduit of the power. And I think that's a very important point, because throughout these studies, we've seen that some of the commentaries sometimes will really play up this angle of Jesus being the agent of God, seemingly distinguishing him from God himself. But this is one of those passages that deeply fuses Jesus with God, in the sense that it is directly, like as Garland puts it, Jesus is not the conduit, but rather the source of the power. So he is the power. He is what she has faith in, and it saves her. But moving down, the phrase "made well" affirms both the woman's hope in verse 28 to be made well and live, and Jairus' plea in verse 23 that Jesus lay hands on his daughter so that she might be made well. Of course, remember, that's the language of saved. And Boring concludes of this narrative, "The focus is Christological. Mark is untroubled by human traits such as having Jesus ask informational questions. Mark's dialectic of humanity and divinity are woven into this story too. Divine power comes out of him, not through him. He himself is the source of the power, not merely its vehicle. He does not pray to someone else, but acts on his own. It is not the power of faith, but the divine power of Jesus that heals. She does not say to herself, 'If I believe strongly enough,' but believes in Jesus' power to heal. Yet Jesus does not say, 'My power has healed you,' but 'Your faith has saved you.'" Edwards also adds here, "Her fear and trembling are not met with reproach or censure, but with tender compassion. 'Daughter, your faith has healed you.' The Greek word 'healed' can mean either heal or save, depending on the context. The ESV, 'made well.' The spoken Hebrew and Aramaic term behind it, Yeshua, is actually a variant of the Hebrew name of Jesus, Yeshua. In a way the woman cannot yet know, the desire for healing and wholeness is the desire for Jesus. Jesus' final word to the woman is a veritable benediction. Go in peace. And with that, Mark returns the narrative back to Jairus. Now, we need to picture this almost like a play or something, right? So Jesus gives her this benediction. Go in peace. Your faith has saved you. And as he's saying this to the woman, we read in verse 35, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, 'Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?' But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, 'Do not fear, only believe.'" You remember, this is the whole center of the narrative chiastically. Now, as Boring writes, and we'll move further down his quotation, "He," that is Jairus, "has been one who believes and hopes, but is literal physical death the death of hope?" The present imperatives of verse 36 are important. Jairus had already manifested faith in coming to Jesus. Now he has become fearful. He is challenged by the new report. He can no longer ask for healing. Jesus challenges him to overcome his fear, as had the woman, and to continue his faith in imitation of the woman's. As I write here, in other words, this mirrors the woman's perseverance. She acted in faith despite years of suffering. Now Jairus is invited to respond similarly, not to retreat in fear, but to maintain faith beyond what seems reasonable. Edwards writes, "There is still one thing Jairus can do, but he must shift his focus from the circumstances of his daughter's death to Jesus himself. Don't be afraid, only believe." This is the challenge before Jairus and before everyone who meets Jesus, to believe only in what circumstances allow, or to believe in the God who makes all things possible. One thing only is necessary: to believe. The present tense of the Greek imperative means to keep believing, to hold on to faith rather than to give in to despair. With respect to his daughter's circumstances, Jairus' future is closed, but with respect to Jesus, it is still open. Faith is not something Jairus has, but something that has Jairus, carrying him from despair to hope. Jesus' authoritative word to Jairus is not to fear, but to believe. And down to verses 37 and 38, Jesus is going to take his inner circle of Peter, James, and John. And when they get to the house, Jesus saw a commotion. People were weeping and wailing loudly. Though ritualized mourning and even professional hired mourners were common, the intense outpour of emotion may indicate that the child had just died. And in verses 39 and 40, when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Now Collins here picks up with kind of what we just pointed out. The description of the scene in the house of Jairus as a disturbance suggests that the girl has died recently and that the mourning is spontaneous rather than ritualized. Jesus' statement, "the child is not dead but is sleeping," in verse 39, introduces an element of ambiguity into the narrative. I don't think it does, but continuing with Collins, it raises the question for those in the audience of Mark who are familiar with stories about people who only appeared to be dead, whether the girl was really dead. The narrative rhetoric of the story, however, makes clear that the girl is really dead. Jesus' remark is an indication of the ease with which he will be able to awaken her. There's actually quite a bit of discussion about this, whether this is like a resuscitation or a resurrection. So I kind of write a summary here. The comment that the child is sleeping has received considerable attention in the commentaries. Although it was once fashionable in the post-Enlightenment period to interpret this passage as a story of resuscitation rather than resurrection, the consensus among modern scholars, commentators, is that Mark and the other synoptic writers clearly present the child as having died. If sleep is simply a euphemism for death, then Jesus' statement appears tautological. The child is not dead, but dead. Yet the distinction lies in perspective. In ordinary human experience, the difference between sleep and death is that death is final while sleep is temporary. But to the Christian, even death is rendered temporary by the hope of resurrection. In this light, Jesus' words redefine death itself as a kind of sleep, something from which one will awaken. And so thus, Gulick writes, "How could Jesus say the girl was not dead? Some would answer quite literally, meaning she was only apparently dead." And this reminds me of The Princess Bride, mostly dead. But this solution does violence to the story's flow by ignoring the messenger's report in 535 and the presence of the mourners in 538, not to mention the fact that Jesus had yet to see the child. Jesus' reference to the girl's sleeping corresponds with his word that summons her to arise or wake up. And I would also say to Jairus' own name, if indeed his name means to awaken. Back to Gulick, therefore, the statement to the mourners explaining his question about their commotion is the same cloth as Jesus' earlier assurance to Jairus to have no fear but merely have faith. Jesus viewed her death, which was real, in light of the approaching miracle. In other words, though she is dead, her death will be no more permanent than a sleep, in view of what Jesus was about to do. And Boring similarly picks up, when Jesus declares the girl is not dead but sleeping, the professional experts on death laugh him to scorn, but he was expressing resurrection faith in the later Christian language. Death is called sleep, not to pretend it is not real, but to deny that it is ultimate. Jesus does not say, the girl only seems to be dead, but in the presence of death speaks the word of eschatological victory over death. At the story level, the professional mourners and attending crowd laugh, not at Jesus' claim to raise the dead, which he has not made, but at his foolish misdiagnosis without ever seeing the patient. But the reader knows and hears it as misplaced scorn at Christian resurrection faith. Compare Acts 17:32. And then down to verse 41. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And quite literally, it's little lamb, arise. Edwards writes that this phrase here is Aramaic. Talitha is a feminine form of the word for lamb or youth, and cum is an imperative meaning arise. Some previous commentators, as I write here, believe the Aramaic phrase functioned as a sort of magic formula. However, as Boring observes, by translating the phrase, Mark removes the story from the world of magic and focuses on the authority of Jesus that cannot be resisted even by the power of death. In combination with the other features mentioned above, the reference to the girl's age seems deliberate. The reader has not been able to picture the daughter until this disclosure by the narrative. Contrast Luke, which places this information in the opening lines of the story. Now at the end of the combined stories, a revelatory insight is disclosed. The child is a young woman, ready to launch on a meaningful and fulfilled life. Just as the woman sick for 12 years is restored to such a life. In verse 42, and immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. Mark now links the child's age with the length of affliction of the woman in the previous narrative. France, though not convinced, discusses the potential resurrection language in this narrative and is going to be commenting on this language here of little girl arise, and then when the girl gets up in the next verse. So, as France writes, it is possible that the use of the verbs arise and get up, both of which occur frequently in the New Testament to denote the resurrection both of Jesus and of believers, serve to suggest to Mark's readers the idea that in this resuscitation of the dead girl, there was a foreshadowing of the power over death, which would be the basis of the Christian faith. But the verbs are common ones, and in this story could hardly have been avoided. Mark gives no overt indication that he wishes to suggest a resurrection typology. This was, after all, a return to earthly life and subsequent death, not resurrection. I actually think that it's a fair point here that this is rather generic language. And to tell the story, you are going to need to use this kind of language. But on the other hand, I kind of disagree as I write, yet perhaps that is precisely why this particular story was chosen to be told. Consider the final verse of John's Gospel. That's John 21:25. Now there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself cannot contain the books that would be written. By selecting this particular narrative, one in which Jesus is portrayed as a greater Elisha, the gospel authors are able to foreshadow Jesus' own resurrection, and note specifically Isaiah 26:19, found within Isaiah's mini apocalypse. The dead will rise. And so here we are with that language, which is get up over here. And those in the tombs will be raised, which is when Jesus says, I say to you, arise. And those in the earth will rejoice, so on and so forth. And of course, I have the language here, Mark verse 41 and 42. So I don't think that it's quite so far-fetched to think that Mark is intending to foreshadow resurrection. I mean, I think personally that Jairus' name is the foreshadowing of what happens in the narrative itself. The divine warrior on the scene to inaugurate this new age. And to be fair, I'm sure some people would say, well, you've had your head in this stuff, divine warrior stuff. You've been tracking on it. And so it's easy to see it everywhere. You're going to see it all over the place. And again, I think that's a fair point to make. But my counter to that would be, yes, I think I see it everywhere because I've looked at it quite a bit and it's in my mind a lot. But I would argue that the ancient initiated reader knows this stuff far better than I do. Their minds were far deeper into it than I am. And so I think they would have picked up this kind of stuff as well. But continuing on, I'm just pointing out here that at the end of verse 42, that they were overcome with amazement. This is going to call back all the way back to Mark 2:12, when the paralytic got up and took his bed, that the people were amazed. And it looks forward to next chapter when Jesus walks on the sea. The disciples were astounded, same language. Now down to verse 43, and he strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. This is the only example of the charge to secrecy being honored. And Collins writes here, the placement at the end of the narrative of the remark that she should be given something to eat formed a literary bridge to the next passage in the source, the accounts of the multiplication of the loaves. It is noteworthy that the object of secrecy in verse 43 is not the identity of Jesus, in which Mark is interested, but a state of affairs. This suggests that the command of secrecy is traditional and not an addition to Mark. And that is chapter 5. And we've seen this escalating intensification of miracles. Jesus calming the sea, which induces fear in the disciples. Jesus casting out legion, which also produces fear in the people. And it seems like we're building this momentum that's like unstoppable. But then we get to chapter 6, where we're going to see what happens when the people lack faith. And so we're going to begin here with a sober reminder, but that will be picked up next time.